In the quiet dawn of the medieval world, the land of Europe stretched vast and uncertain, wrapped in mist and memory where forests pressed, close to human settlements, and rivers carved slow paths through valleys of survival and ambition. This was an age where kingdoms were not born from ink and parchment, but from blood oaths, iron blades, and the fragile promise of protection. Wooden huts clustered beneath looming hills, while early stone keeps rose like defiant scars against the sky. Peasants woke before sunrise, their breath visible in the cold air, hands rough from soil and frost as church bells echoed faintly, calling both faith and obedience. The smell of damp earth mixed with wood smoke and freshly baked coarse bread is life unfolded in cycles ruled by seasons, hunger, and prayer. Above them, the nobility wrapped in wool and fur surveyed lands they claimed by divine right, believing God himself had stitched crowns to their bloodlines. Power moved slowly, then carried by horses, messengers, and rumor. Yet its weight was immense, shaping lives before words were spoken. As iron was forged in smoky workshops, sparks flew like stars, illuminating blackened faces and ringing hammers that sounded like the heartbeat of a rising world. These early kingdoms grew from Roman ruins and tribal legacies, blending law with legend as kings struggled to hold fractured lands together against invasion, famine, and betrayal. Castles were not symbols of glory alone, but shelters against chaos. Their walls thick and cold, their halls echoing with footsteps, torchlight, and whispered schemes. Beyond the walls, marketplaces breathed with life, where traders shouted over clinking coins and bleeding animals, where spices from distant lands hinted at worlds few would ever see. Yet beneath this fragile order lay constant fear as borders shifted without warning, and war was not an event, but a condition of existence. Winter winds howled through cracks in timber homes, carrying hunger and disease, while summers brought hope and harvest, and the threat of marching armies on the horizon. Kingdoms rose not in triumph, but in tension, balanced between unity and collapse, as loyalty was bought with land and steel rather than trust. In this beginning, Europe was not yet a continent of nations, but a living Satterfield of ambition, belief, and survival, where every dawn carried the question of endurance and every dusk closed with prayers whispered under flickering candles, hoping the walls would hold through the night. As the kingdoms hardened into power, the age of war unfolded like a storm that never truly passed as banners snapped in cold winds, and armored men marched across muddy fields driven by loyalty, fear, and the promise of reward. Iron helmets pressed low over weary eyes, chainmail rattled with every step, and the smell of sweat, leather, and oil filled the air, long before swords ever met. War in the medieval world was intimate, brutal, and relentless, fought at shouting distance, where the clash of steel rang like thunder and the ground drank deeply from the fallen. Castles became the anchors of survival, rising from stone and mortar, with towers watching the horizon day and night. Their gates reinforced with oak and iron, designed to outlast hunger as much as attack. Inside those walls, life tightened into routine as defenders rationed bread, salted meat, and hope, listening to the distant drumbeats and horns of besieging armies. Below the battlements, peasants fled burning villages carrying what little they owned as smoke curled into the sky, and livestock scattered into forests that once promised safety but now hid danger. Kings rode at the head of their armies, cloaked in symbols of divine authority, believing victory proved their chosen right to rule, while defeat threatened not only crowns but the fragile belief that held realms together. Monasteries copied texts by candlelight even as war raged outside, preserving knowledge. While praying their walls would be spared, blacksmiths worked without rest, reforging broken blades and arrowheads, their forges glowing through the night like beacons of endurance. Siege engines creaked and groaned as they hurled stone and fire against walls built by generations past, turning engineering into an art of destruction. Disease spread faster than armies, as crowded camps bred sickness and despair, reminding all that survival was never guaranteed. Alliances shifted like sand as marriages, treaties, and betrayals redrew borders without mercy, and loyalty was tested with gold, land, and blood. The soundscape of this era was unending metal on metal, shouted orders, horses screaming, and the dull silence after battle when the wind moved through the dead. Yet even in war, life persisted as children were born, fields replanted, and prayers spoken, because the medieval world allowed no pause, only endurance. These wars did not simply decide rulers, they reshaped landscapes, emptied towns, and carved trauma into memory, forging kingdoms through suffering where power was proven not by peace but by the ability to survive endless conflict. As centuries turned and the weight of power grew heavier, the great medieval kingdoms began to fracture from within their collapse, arriving not with a single blow, but with slow unraveling, felt and empty treasuries, restless streets, and whispered doubt. The castles that once promised safety now stood as cold reminders of control, their walls towering over populations strained by taxes, forced labor, and endless demands of war. Harvests failed as climate shifts and exhaustion of the land brought hunger back to the villages where fields lay thin and tools wore down faster than they could be repaired. The sound of grain mills slowed, and bread grew scarce, filling the air with anxiety instead of warmth. Disease crept silently through crowded towns, carried by fleas, water, and fear, turning bustling markets into places of mourning as bells tolled for the dead again and again. Faith, once unshakable, began to crack as prayers went unanswered, and divine right felt hollow in the face of suffering. Kings struggled to command loyalty as nobles rebelled, peasants resisted, and armies demanded payment that no longer existed. The rise of towns and trade created new powers outside the castle walls, merchants and guilds, who measured influence in coin rather than lineage, quietly shifting the balance of control. Forgotten technologies resurfaced, and new ones spread as gunpowder weapons challenged armored knights, rendering centuries of martial tradition vulnerable. The sound of cannon fire echoed across stone fortifications once thought eternal, shattering not only walls but the idea that the old order could endure. Forests retreated as populations moved and economies changed, transforming landscapes shaped by feudal bonds into spaces of movement and opportunity. Revolts flared, driven by hunger, injustice, and the growing realization that obedience was no longer survival. Records once kept by monks now passed into secular hands as knowledge slowly escaped the cloister. The medieval world felt itself slipping into something unfamiliar as tradition clashed with necessity, and innovation pressed forward without permission. When kingdoms finally fell, they did so amid silence, as much as violence abandoned halls, wind-blown banners, and thrones left cold. Yet from collapse came transformation as the ruins of medieval power became the foundation of a new age where memory of stone castles, iron swords, and torchlit halls lingered like echoes, reminding Europe that rise, war, and collapse were not endings, but chapters in a long, restless human story. In the aftermath of fallen crowns and broken walls, the medieval world did not disappear, but reshaped itself slowly, like stone worn by water, as survivors adapted to a landscape filled with ruins, memory, and possibility. Villages rebuilt around old roads and river crossings, where trade once again breathed life into empty spaces, and the sound of carts and bargaining voices replaced the silence of abandonment. Former knights turned into landholders, mercenaries, or forgotten figures as their armor rusted and their skills lost value in a changing age. The castles that still stood became administrative centers, prisons, or symbols of a past authority no longer feared in the same way. People dressed differently now, mixing practicality with remnants of tradition, will still rough but cuts simpler, suited for labor and travel rather than ceremony. The rhythm of daily life shifted toward markets, workshops, and town councils where decisions were debated rather than decreed. Blacksmiths adapted their craft, shaping farming tools, nails, and early firearms. As sparks continued to rise into smoky air, carrying continuity through change, education slowly expanded beyond monasteries, as literacy crept into merchant families and city records, preserving memory in ink instead of song alone. Faith remained central, but transformed as institutions faced scrutiny and belief became more personal, less bound to unquestioned power. Forests once feared were cleared further, as population growth demanded land, altering ecosystems that had sheltered medieval life for centuries. The soundscape of Europe softened from constant battle into negotiation, commerce, and construction, though echoes of conflict never fully faded. Old survival methods evolved as crop rotation improved, storage techniques expanded, and communal systems replaced feudal obligation with shared responsibility. Forgotten technologies of Roman roads, aqueducts, and urban planning were studied, revived, and adapted, linking the past to the future. Weather still ruled human fate, as winters remained harsh and summers unpredictable, but resilience had been learned through generations of hardship. Memory lingered in stories told by hearth fires where elders spoke of armored riders, sieges, and long nights behind walls, reminding the young of what endurance once meant. The medieval age left behind more than ruins. It left a mindset, shaped by survival hierarchy, faith, and transformation that continued to influence law, culture, and identity. In this quiet continuation, Europe stepped forward, carrying the weight of its medieval kingdoms, not as chains, but as foundations upon which a new world slowly rose, shaped by lessons carved in stone and remembered in silence. As the final echoes of the medieval kingdoms faded into memory, Europe stood at a threshold, where the past still breathed through stone and soil, yet the future pressed forward with quiet determination. The great forests that once hid armies and outlaws now bordered expanding towns where new voices shaped identity through trade, craft, and shared ambition. The legacy of medieval rule lived on in laws, traditions, and borders drawn by long-forgotten struggles, reminding people that power once rose from swords and belief rather than consensus. Castles remained on hilltops, their shadows stretching across valleys, not as threats, but as witnesses to centuries of endurance, ambition, and loss. Inside their abandoned halls, wind moved freely, carrying the scent of moss, dust, and cold ironware. Banners once hung, and footsteps once echoed with authority. The medieval world had taught Europe how to survive scarcity, how to organize labor, how to believe in something greater, even when the world seemed cruel and uncertain. The rhythms of agrarian life persisted as farmers still rose with the sun, listening to birds and wind, while tending fields shaped by generations before them. Yet now, these lives were increasingly connected to wider networks of exchange, where ideas traveled faster than armies once did. The sound of forging iron still rang through workshops, but no longer solely for war, instead shaping plows, hinges, and tools that promised stability rather than conquest. Memory became a powerful force as chroniclers, artists, and storytellers preserved the age, not as it truly was, but as it felt, a time of honor, brutality, faith, and survival woven together. Myths of chivalry and noble kings softened the harsh reality of hunger, disease, and fear, creating an identity Europe carried forward into literature, culture, and national pride. The lessons of collapse remained etched deeply as rulers learned that unchecked power fractured realms and that loyalty could not be sustained by fear alone. Even the church evolved, shaped by centuries of influence and challenge, leaving behind structures that still guided belief while adapting to new social realities. The medieval era ended, not with silence, but with transformation, as its people unknowingly prepared the ground for exploration, science, and political change that would redefine the continent. Winter winds still swept across stone bridges and ancient roads, carrying whispers of armored marches and torchlit nights, reminding travelers that every step rested upon layered history. The smell of bread baking in village ovens carried continuity, from medieval hearths to modern homes, linking generations through simple acts of survival and comfort. Europe emerged from its medieval age, scarred but wiser, carrying forward resilience forged through war, faith, and endurance. In the end, the rise, war, and collapse of medieval kingdoms were not failures, but necessary passages shaping a civilization that learned through suffering how to rebuild, remember, and continue. And as the sun set behind ruined towers and living cities alike, it illuminated a truth, written not in chronicles but in human persistence, that even as kingdoms fall, humanity endures, reshaping the world again and again through memory, labor, and hope.